Now I request Professor Siddiq Ali deliver his lecture.
Let me begin by Professor Amina Kishore and her energetic team of young teachers in the Department of English at MANUU for having invited me to be here this afternoon to share some of my random thoughts on the theme of this conference. I would like to confess that I don't have any research paper to present before you. These are some of the ideas which have occurred to me. I also, when I received this invitation, I also felt a little inadequate in coming here, in the sense that I have been teaching only native English literature. That's principally American literature. As such, I don't have much grounding in the phrase non-native literatures in English. But anyhow, in the morning also we had some discussion about the title and the theme of this conference. Certain reservations were made. I too have certain reservations against the terminology which is used. For instance, the very word native and non-native, I don't think they are relevant today on account of, what we refer to as English as a global language today. We live in a global village, so English is a global language. And also, when we talk of English today, rightly, of course, it is mentioned here, literatures in English. Then today we have accepted varieties of English. There are a number of Englishes as such. So therefore, which English literature written in which variety of English as such. So there is a lot which can be talked about this. But my purpose here this afternoon is to talk about, the title which I gave when I don't know, he's not here, when Mr. Hasib, Dr. Hasib asked me to give a title, I didn't have anything in mind. So I said, give a title which has a very wide canvas. So I said, Literature Beyond Borders, as such. And this is the point which I start by, making a reference to the morning session where Professor Maurya said literature has no boundaries. And all students of literature do recognize that all great literature or even good literature, transcends all kinds of boundaries. Geographical boundaries, cultural boundaries, historical boundaries. And, many a times, literary boundaries in terms of the genres as such. So therefore, when I say literature beyond borders, also I thought of a subtitle to this. What I am going to focus on is the cross-cultural transactions. Literature beyond borders, cross-cultural transactions. And my focus will be more on American literature in terms of this, cross-border or cross-cultural influences. But before I proceed further, I would also like to say that it is a little disadvantageous to talk after 3 or 4 speakers have already done, because several of the points which I thought I could make have already been made. For instance, Mr. Khidwai talked at a great length, about Orientalism and the presence of the Muslim and the Arab, in literature. He traced it right from, the times of Chaucer to the present times as such. Anyhow, I had also thought of talking about, 3 or 4, depending upon the time I have with me now, I would like to talk about the impact or the influence of some of these Oriental writers. Some of the well-known, classics of, Arabic literature and Persian literature, or Persian poets and Arabic poets on English literature as such. And some of these names are so well known that all of you would recognize them instantly. I'm not going to reveal them right now. Let me also make a further point about, before I talk about these 3 or 4, major writers and their impact on West. I would also once again go back to the question of, the seminar. When I looked at the flyer of the seminar, there were so many sub-themes. I thought that what I am going to speak will fit into 2 or 3 of these themes. Like there was a theme, about Muslim literatures. There was a theme about, new areas of research as such. So therefore, maybe what I am going to say today can be viewed in terms of 2 or 3 of these, aspects mentioned in the flyer as such. Now, the first text I am going to talk about is the Arabian Nights. Reference has already been made about the Arabian Nights. Now, ever since its translation and publication in English in the 18th century, the Arabian Nights have enjoyed immense popularity in the West. Variously known as 1001 Nights or Arabian Nights, Alif Laila in Arabic, is not credited to any single author. In fact, obscurity shrouds its origin and genesis as such. Some scholars have tried to trace it to Persia, 8th and 9th century Persia, and linked it to the Hazar Afsane as such. Without going into that controversy, without tracing the actual roots, I would like to say that anyone familiar with the Arabian Nights would see it to be a blend of Hellenistic, Persian, Indian, Egyptian, fiction. It is also seen as a combination of several literary genres. Now, this is very important because I am trying to link it to, link Arabian Nights to modern literature and postmodern literature. Because Arabian Nights cannot be clubbed or seen only as a single genre. It is a combination of several literary genres, including, travel literature, biography, anecdotes, romances, folklore, and popular culture and literature. Thematically, too, it is varied and diverse, comprising tales of pure morality on the one hand and sensuality on the other. It contains stories of love, romance, passion, crime, piety, holiness, magic, and fantasy. These features, I am sure, those familiar with modern and postmodern literature, would agree, would qualify this also to be a work written in the modern and the postmodern mode as such. By 19th century, Arabian Nights was available in several European translations. The first French translation by Antonio Gallard appeared between 1703 and 1713 in 12 volumes. The first English translation came out in 1811 by Jonathan Scott in 6 volumes. However, it was Richard Burton's first annotated English translation, which appeared in 1885, that gained phenomenal success. Burton's translation was the first unexpurgated translation. By comparison, another translation by Lane had the stamp of Victorian morality on it, with the exclusion of the sensual side of Arabian Nights. Now, Burton's translation is considered to be perhaps more authentic than the other earlier translations, because it was, for 2 reasons. It was an annotated edition in English, and secondly, it is said that Burton had traveled to Arabia. He had visited the Holy Lands also disguised as a Muslim, and he had, with his own eyes, looked at the culture and the language and the lives of the people of that region as such. Now, that the Arabian Nights exercised tremendous influence on the English Romantics and the Victorians is an established fact. I'm not going into the details. In the morning, Dr. Khidwai made references to some of them, like Thomas More's Lala Ruh, and then Byron's Turkish Tales, Keats' Eve of St. Agnes and Endymion, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, reflect a marked influence of the Arabian Night Tales. In their settings, dramatic personae, images, descriptive and descriptive machinery. Ruskin once said that the Arabian Nights presented him with a wealth of imagery and illusions and enriched his own literary compositions. Many studies have been undertaken to document this intercultural borrowing as such. Again, Dr. Khidwai, talked about the hundreds of, books, and research articles written in this field. It is not the sheer exotism of these tales, but reflections on the meaning of life, moral values, which left an instructive and emotional imprint on millions of readers in the West. Now, the literary features of these tales or these stories, which were not recognized at home, captivated the discerning readers and literary figures all over the world, including England and Europe. According to Robert Irwin, a noted medieval historian, American writers and scholars, American writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Washington Irving, and not to mention of writers like Prof, Joyce, and Dickens, all incorporated motifs from the 1001 Nights in their works. The Arabian Nights became a window to the social dynamics of the medieval Arab society. It seems to have influenced the who's who of American authors in the 19th century. Now, it is heartening to note that in recent times, a growing body of scholarship on the hitherto neglected classic is growing. Attempts to establish the narrative dynamics of Arabian Nights and its impact on recent writings are on the rise. Principally, the frame story of Shahrazad, a generative mechanism whose power has been long recognized, is being brought to the foreground. Relationship between the old ancient Sanskrit, Panchatantra, and the works of writers like John Barth and Borges is being worked out. Now let me now look at, the treatment of Arabian Nights at the hands of two American fiction writers, one from the 19th century and another from the 20th century. I am referring to Edgar Allan Poe and John Barth. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is regarded as the pioneer of short story in English. He was deeply influenced by the Arabian Nights. One of his stories, The 1002nd Tale of Shahrazad, 1002nd Tale, not 1001, 1002nd Tale of Shahrazad, depicts the final voyage of Sinbad the Sailor. This 1845 short story is a satirical variation of the popular Arabian Nights. In Poe's version, the narrator discovers a long-lost Oriental text which tells this story of Shahrazad. We learn that on the 1002nd night, Shahrazad tells the story of Sinbad, whose adventures are just as those told in the popular version of Arabian Nights. However, the crucial difference is that at the end of the story, the king Shahryar, you know that Shahrazad tells the stories to King Shahryar, the king feels that he can no longer be fooled and orders the execution of Shahrazad by throttling her. This was the crucial change, which Edgar Allan Poe brought about, in the ending of this story as such. Now, Shahrazad, knowing that the king was a man of scrupulous integrity, most unlikely to forfeit his words, submits to her fate with, according to Poe, in quotes, good grace. She has the consolation that Shahryar has been deprived of many inconceivable adventures. Now, this is what makes me wonder how, the Western writers have tried to, give a different kind of a treatment to this very enchanting and fascinating character of Shahrazad, the protagonist in many ways of that book. This portrayal of Shahrazad is in direct contrast to the figure of the original Shahrazad of Arabian Nights. The Eastern Shahrazad is radically transformed in the hands of Poe. In the original version, she is learned, talented, and smart. She uses her intelligence to challenge the king. She uses her head to save her body, while those unfortunate before her had their bodies used only to lose their heads. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story of Arabian Nights, how King Shahryar used to, get all those women executed, after every night. And then, but she used her head to save her body, while those unfortunate before her had their bodies used only to lose their heads. Now, Shahrazad shows how a woman can use her mind and intelligence and brain to rebel. She succeeds in getting the king to stop the carnage as such. Not only that, Shahryar officially acknowledged that a man should use words instead of violence to settle their disputes. She convinces him. Now, This is a modern thought. Shahryar commands words, not armies, to transform her situation, and this adds another dimension to the tales as a modern civilizing myth. They are a sample of the triumph of reason over violence. No wonder Shahzad can be seen as a hero, a liberator of the medieval times. Now, look at this difference. It is possible for us, if you read the original Arabian Nights and the character of Shahzad depicted there, can be given in a new kind of a reading, both in terms of, the narrative as well as the theme. She could be considered a feminist of first order as such, in that sense. So there can be a feminist approach which can be applied. And so therefore, we can re-examine, this text as, a postmodern text as such. Now, what happens to Shahzad in Poe's tale we have seen? In the East, she had, as I told you, the mind, the head. She used it to save it and saved it. In the West, she became all body and was consumed and was finally killed. According to one commentator, Poe killed her, or in the words of that commentator, as the commentator put it, Poe killed her in quotes, cold ink. In cold ink. Now, you see, the critic questions the audacity, the temerity of Poe to add an extra tale and make Shahzad submit to her fate with good grace. Now you see how it is possible for us to re-examine all these ancient texts. And then, today we talk in terms of structuralism, post-structuralism, modernism, postmodernism. Everything can be traced back. Like, you can trace back everything to Shakespeare. All movements. So also we can trace back all the modern movements back to their original roots as such. Earlier, I have said that in recent past attempts have been made to apply modern critical methodology and tools to study this intricate literary classic. Scholars are now trying to attempt a postmodern and structural analysis in addition to the traditional use of mythology, folklore, and allegory to explain the literary merit of Arabian Nights. This text has been subjected to a close analysis to illustrate the internal cohesion of the work and to reveal the dialectics of the frame story and the cycle of narratives. One such study analyzes Arabian Nights in relation to works by Indian, European, and American modern writers like Borges and Barr, and places Arabian Nights in the context of an ongoing storytelling tradition and traces its influence on world literature. What is significant is that the Arabian Nights is now being posited in modern and postmodern discourses. Now, this seminar is also meant to address issues relating to new areas of research. This is what I wanted to point out, that some young scholar can take up this kind of a study and re-examine these classics, in terms of the modern critical theories as such. The next American writer who seems to have come under deep influence of Arabian Nights, and particularly the character of Shahzad, is John Barr. John Barr of Sawtweed Factor, of Giles Court Boy, Lost in the Fun House. A contemporary writer known variously as an absurdist, a black humorist, a nihilist, a satirist, and whatnot. Now, John Barr's fascination of Arabian Nights stems from his student days at Johns Hopkins University, where he had a part-time job of filing books at the classics department and the stacks of the Oriental Seminary. And on one day, he chanced upon these two books while filing them in the shelves in the library. He came across these two titles and started reading them. During this period, he got enchanted with Richard Burton's annotated translation of Arabian Nights and also the 10th century Sanskrit classic Ocean Story, which in fact is Katha Sarik Sagar by Somadev, 10th century, Sanskrit classic. So he was so fascinated by these two texts that these two books played a very important role in the development of Barr's literary style and theory. Barr found in the example of Shahzad a woman escaping execution through creativity. A woman escaping execution through creativity. He found it very useful as he experimented with the writing of self-reflexive fiction and the metafiction. As he reasons it in Friday book, one of his very important works, later works, Friday book, John Barr says, "We tell stories and listen to them because we live in them." Barr says, "To cease to narrate is to die. To stop to narrate is to die." This is what would have happened if she had stopped telling her stories. Shahzad would have been put to death. So to cease to narrate is to die. If this is true, then not only all fiction is fiction, all fiction is fiction about fiction, but also fiction about fiction and in fact fiction about life. Barth was fascinated and haunted by the character of Shahzad from the time he got acquainted with the Arabian Nights. In an interview, he said, to quote him, though the tales she tells are not my favorite, she remains my favorite teller. Now, what he is pointing out is towards the art of narration. She is my favorite storyteller. For him, she becomes emblematic as well as a figurative aspiration that, there's no art in their approach. So how to face such a life? What do we do in such a condition where we do not have any control over what we do or what we say? Where human beings we are just like, nuts and bolts, of a machinery as such. So therefore, to commit literary or figurative suicide, Barth saw in Shahzad, again to put in quotes, the haunting guest and the hopefulest storyteller. She spoke to his heart directly and intimately. She faces all the problems of Parish, and it is not very true in India, but if you go abroad, particularly if you go to the United States of America, all the while you meet young teachers there. They are all worried about getting a tenure, every tenure as such. So, not enough to have satisfaction. She is only as good as her next piece. Barth liked Shahzad so much that he role in Chimera, which was his Nobel Prize winning novel, The Tidewater Tales, The Last Voyage of Somebody's Sailor, the figure of Shahzad. She is the continuous creating self of every one of us. She is the continuous creating self of every one of us. The stories she tells evolve into myths which become the reason behind our actions and which in turn become our ideology or society. When Barth rewrote the tale of Arabian Nights in camera, he rewrites it from the perspective of Shahzad's sister. Wrote the frame tale in Tidewater Tales, The Last Voyage of Sinbad, retells Sinbad's story. Barth was of the view that history repeats itself in farce, and stories told again and again, and is new only because of the parody. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this very famous essay by John Barth called The Literature of Exhaustion, wherein he says that all forms of literature are today exhausted. There is nothing new which can be done. So what do we need to do now? How do the writers survive? What do they do? What is the option before them? Say, it's like, coming to an end of the road. By the way, that's one of the titles of Barth's book, The End of the Road. We have come to the end of the road. All forms are exhausted. There is a literary exhaustion. So he says that the old forms can be renewed. The old tales can be told with what can be parodied. So he talked a lot about parody. The fairy tale genre has been particularly valuable for Barth, who uses it with intricate plots of transformation. The exhibition explored the transformation of an obscure Persian poet from obscurity to celebrity status in Britain and America. Khayyam became popular from 1880s to the 1950s. Through the late 19th century, his reputation grew largely due to the translations done by Edward Fitzgerald. Generations of beatniks, existential thinkers, skeptics, cynics, and longing for nothing more than a life of wine and sensation and pleasure, did not find a better literary inspiration than the immortal Khayyam, they thought. After an unpromising start, the Rubaiyat, and in its several versions, went on to become one of the best-known poems of English-speaking world and an all-time bestseller. A Persian poet, mathematician, and an astronomer, Umar Khayyam has invited divergent views from scholars. Now, in popular perception, he is a pleasure seeker. He teaches, he gives us the message of lead a life, drink, be merry, as such. But he has been seen in extremely different ways. At one extreme, we see nightclubs named after Umar Khayyam. And he's seen as a hedonist. There have been hedonists. In American literature also you have seen the Beatles, the hippies, and the others, who are a kind of hedonists. And on the other, he's seen as a mystical Sufi poet, influenced by Platonic tradition. Thus, it is largely due to his popularity, as you know, is largely due to the translations done by Fitzgerald. But in recent times, it is being questioned how faithful has been the translation of Fitzgerald. And at this juncture, I would also like to make a mention of the fact that it was Emerson who first translated Umar Khayyam, and not Edward Fitzgerald, because Fitzgerald's translation, he has dedicated it to Emerson, and Emerson was the first poet in the 19th century, first American poet to have translated verses from Umar Khayyam as such. Now, so therefore, serious scholars have pointed out, at times Fitzgerald lays words upon the tongue of the poet which are blasphemous. Enjoy wine and women and don't be afraid. Umar Khayyam says, we don't know whether it is Umar Khayyam who said it or it is Fitzgerald who is saying it. Enjoy wine and women and don't be afraid. God has compassion. God has compassion. Of course, one thing is very clear, that Umar Khayyam was not an atheist. He believes in God, says God has compassion as such. And Khayyam rejected the strict religious structures and a literal conception of afterlife. According to Syed Hussain Nasr, who is an authority on Persian literature, he is a professor at University of Washington. No other poet, as I told you, is seen in such extremely divergent ways. In fact, the question is Fitzgerald's translation, true to the original model? Is he a hedonist, a fatalist, a skeptic? Syed Hussain Nasr says that it is a correct study of the authentic rubaiyat is done along with the philosophical works and his spiritual biography. We will have a different perception of the man. We will have a different perception of the man. He is not to be seen merely as a hedonist as such, but he has definitely mystical leanings in him. And unfortunately, what has happened is that Umar Khayyam came to Persia via English. When he wrote in Persia, nobody noticed him. When Fitzgerald became popular all over the world, all over the West, he was rediscovered in Persia as such. So therefore, but as I mentioned in the beginning, he's a controversial poet, but he has influenced generations of, scholars and also, people in general in the West. Now, I have just talked about Umar Khayyam and then ended by suggesting that might be, if not a full-blown mystic or a Sufi in the true sense, a genuine Sufi, many people call him as a pseudo-Sufi as such. So whether he is a pseudo-Sufi or, a real Sufi, I am going to now come down to a real Sufi, an authentic Sufi. The next person I am going to talk about is none other than this great man who has been in news in the recent past, Jalaluddin Rumi, and his influence on the West. Now, do I have time, madam? Anyhow, I would like to be very brief. In today's world, as you see, filled with tensions and conflicts, on the one hand, we speak of a global world where cultural boundaries are fast disappearing. On the other hand, we speak of a clash of cultures and civilization. It is therefore surprising and ironical that a poet born in Afghanistan, the land of Talibans, and writing in a tongue spoken by the Iranians, is widely read and appreciated in the West. Now, you see, the New York Times recently declared Rumi the most influential poet in America since 1960s. During the last decade, Rumi has sold more volumes than any other poet in the US today. Community lectures, public readings of his poetry are held in every city of the US. Seminars, workshops, and courses on his poetry are conducted in every major campus in America. No, coming to the current popularity of Rumi, no, there seems to be some kind of a Rumi mania seem to have gripped America today. Rumi T-shirts, coffee mugs, and calendars have appeared on college campuses. Even celebrities like Madonna and Demi Moore and Martin Sheen read translations of Rumi. And not only that, in fashion shows, Donna Karan plays Rumi's recitations. In short, Rumi has been termed into some sort of a new age icon. The current wave of Rumi's popularity in America was sparked by the publication in 1995 of the translation done by Coleman Barks called The Essential Rumi. As said. In an age when even Nobel Prize winning poets barely managed to sell 10,000 copies of collection of poems, Barks's translation of Rumi has sold more than 250,000 volumes of verses. As such, the question which needs to be addressed is what is the reason for this phenomenal popularity of Rumi in America? I don't have time to go into the details to examine this popularity. However, I would just like to make a mention of the fact that to understand the Rumi phenomenon, it is necessary to examine the Oriental influence in American literature in the 19th century. Orientalism was in vogue in Europe in the 8th century onwards. The study of Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Islam was undertaken by European scholars. Of course, it was not until the 18th century that the West was acquainted with the movement of Islamic mysticism known as Sufism and the Sufi poetry of Persia. Hafiz became popular with the publication of a Persian song of Hafiz. Sir William Jones' Asiatic poetry, which appeared in 1792, influenced poets, all the English romantics. In fact, the greatest literary influence, I have already made how, with the help of the Asiatic Society's translation of the Persian poetry, great Persian poets, when these translations came to America, it was appreciated by the American, intellectuals as such. The influence of Sufi poets, Persian Sufi poets, and a large number of 18th century American poets can be seen through study of their works, journals, diaries, and letters. I can go on listing the names of authors like Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Whitman, and Melville. Of course, the greatest literary influence on Emerson from the East was that of Persian poetry. Emerson wrote an essay on Persian poetry and also a preface to Francis Galvin's first American edition of Sadi's Gulistan. For Emerson, Sadi was the ideal poet with whom he identifies himself in an autobiographical poem, Sadi, which appeared in 1842. In his introduction to Gulistan, he says, through his Persian dialect, he speaks to all nations, and like Homer, Shakespeare, Cervantes, and Montaigne, is perfectly modern. Although Emerson called Sadi his ideal poet, he did not admire Hafiz the less. Like Sadi, Hafiz was the cheerer of men's heart. As such. Now, let us turn very briefly our attention to a poet who is generally regarded as the most American of the American poets. I'm referring to Walt Whitman. A close reading of his poetry reveals the abundance of Near Eastern imagery and interest in Egyptology and Sufism. In fact, I would like to draw your attention to one of the poems called the Persian Lesson, which was originally titled as the Sufi Lesson. I would just like to quote a few lines from that poem. It is the central urge in every item to return to its divine source and origin, however latent the same in subject or in object, without one exception. To return to the divine source is Emerson's return to the oversoul, or Whitman's to the great float, as such. There are other, poets and writers of the 19th century who can, America, who can be, mentioned as such. I would not like to go into those details. Some of these major writers I have already mentioned. In fact, what I would like to say is that translation has played a very important role in popularizing and impacting the West as such. But the whole problem with translation is that, there are always doubts raised against translations. A translator has also been referred to as a betrayer. He betrays the original. The translations done by Coleman, Barks, Helmensky, and others of Rumi, coupled with the performative aspects of Sufism through music and dance of the whirling dervishes, has transformed the 13th century mystic of Islamic world into a living celebrity in today's America. There are translations done by Nicholson and Arbery available to us, and some very important work also has been done by Anna Marie Schimmel on Rumi as such. What I would like to say is that the 19th century America was receptive to mystical ideas from other parts of the world. The influence of the Persian poets on 19th century American literature demonstrates America's intellectual receptivity to influences from various streams of thought. Rumi's resurgence after 9/11 is a strong testimony to the continued receptivity in popular American imagination. As an alternative approach to spirituality, Sufism has gained widespread attention in America in recent times. I was talking about Rumi. A genius like Rumi cannot be confined to the regional, cultural, or even religious boundaries. He has transcended time and space to be a living poet. His life and works teach us how to achieve inner peace and curb the tendency of hostility and hatred towards each other in order to achieve harmony. Rumi's life and teachings continue to inspire people from all cultures and religions and backgrounds, despite he being the finest and the most eloquent expression of Islamic mysticism. His Masnavi has been referred to as Quran in Persian. So the source of Rumi's thought is the Quran. I conclude by quoting oft-repeated lines from Rumi. You are here to establish union, but not separation. You are here in this world to establish union, bringing people together and not separating them from each other. So, I think I have taken more than the time which I am supposed to have spoken. In conclusion, I would like to say that as part of the deliberation of this conference, I have tried to point out towards some of the areas which can be examined by younger scholars. You know, for instance, I have talked about the popularity of Rome. Why? Why is it just a passing phase, this phenomenon, like that of Umar Khayyam? Today, nobody talks about Umar Khayyam. But Umar Khayyam, as I told you, was, is not considered to be, a great Sufi like Rumi. But how enduring Rumi's popularity will be in future. United Nations recently, 2 years back, celebrated, the Rumi year as such. So therefore, you have to examine the reasons why. This again opens up this whole idea of these cross-cultural transactions as such. In this political world, we may be at odds with each other. The America and the West and the Muslim world appear to be, there appears to be a wide chasm which has developed unbridgeable gap. But people like Rumi have tried to bridge that gap. So therefore, to bring harmony into this world, through an examination of these literary texts, these literary writings, it is possible for us to consider literature of the world as one literature, neither native literature nor non-native literature, but as world literature, global literature, literature for everyone. Thank you for listening to me patiently.